Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
Welcome to week 5 of the Give and Take on Coalition Radio Network, apparently sponsored by local SEORI. They seem very nice. If we had any sort of digital presence, we would check them out for sure. I'm Zane Wolfang. This is Professor Muggs. We're here today with Pat Ford, as always, or as usual, and a very special guest, a member of the Providence chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Don't run away and hide. Don't go get your guns. It's okay. We're talking to Joel Reinstein today about the Prov DSA chapter and sort of their role in the Rhode Island political ecosystem, and maybe a bit more about the DSA more broadly. So, Joel, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Joel, do you want to start maybe telling us a little bit about yourself, about your role with Democratic Socialists of America more generally, and with the Providence chapter specifically, and how you came to occupy that role?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I think, I've been someone who thought of myself as a socialist for going on now, I'd say about 8 years. Since that time, I've been involved in a lot of activism in different places I've lived. Most recently, working as a labor organizer, which I'm really glad to be doing. It's really fulfilling, meaningful work to me. And only just recently actually took the plunge and joined the Democratic Socialists of America alongside, I think, tens of thousands of other people who've only recently joined the organization in the last 4 years. So, I think I'd leave it at that.
Right. I would agree. The Democratic Socialists of America have certainly been around for a long time on the fringe. We here at the Coalition know some things about the fringe, but have risen to more prominence. I think very concurrently with Bernie Sanders sort of making more of a name for himself. But I don't want to reduce the Democratic Socialists of America to this sort of like American tendency towards celebrity culture and towards old-fashioned great man thinking. It is a rising movement. We see Ocasio-Cortez, Presley, Ilhan Omar, Bowman, right? We see more and more younger politicians being elected Sanders was an outlier for decades and decades and carried the torch nobly. But there is a whole crop, I think, of young Americans who are gravitating towards democratic socialism in greater numbers. And I think we want to ask you, and I don't think this is too basic of a question for myself or for our audience, for our legions of listeners. But can you just talk to us about what socialism is, and then maybe more specifically what democratic socialism is? Because I don't think we learn about it very much in school here in the United States, and I think it is a word that has carried a lot of negative connotations in American culture for a long time. So can you kind of just give us in very broad strokes, what is socialism and what is democratic socialism, and maybe some examples of that in the world today?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd say there are examples I could point to in the world today. I think your listeners could check out dsausa.org. We have a section on our website, What is Democratic Socialism? And that's kind of got the perspective of our organization nationally. But just kind of briefly, I think socialists say that the economy and our society should be run democratically to meet human needs and not to make profits for a few. I think the working class, the overwhelming majority of people, we're the ones who do the work that keeps society going. We should be the ones to democratically be calling the shots. And I think the question I have is, who's calling the shots right now in this country? I kind of think, with this pandemic, with the unfolding economic catastrophe it's brought, and also with the reckoning with racist police violence that's returned as it's from 2014, from 2012, from throughout American history. I think those things together right now are really exposing how hollow democracy really is in this country. I think when you look at tens of millions of people have been laid off. 1 in 2 American adults are unemployed. Millions of people are now facing evictions. And we see that COVID unemployment support, the extra $600, is expiring. And still no Medicare for all.
I do think that I think that will most likely be renewed. But I think it's worth maybe. I think the COVID relief stuff is a great like really accessible example of like a democratic socialist approach. Ironically enough, because it was dispersed by the Trump administration, right, in a technical sense. And it was dispersed by, and the way it was sold to a conservative constituency in my eyes was that it was a stopgap. Like the expiration was sort of key to this being okay with people generally of means who don't want to see this aid just being given out indefinitely. Whereas a guy like Sanders was out there very early on calling for policies. And I want to go back later because I was surprised when you said you couldn't think of, or you didn't think there were any examples in the world. Because I know sort of commonly that people tend to point to some Nordic countries for examples of at least hybrid democratic socialist systems. But the notion of giving out this COVID relief aid, of just providing this steady income for every person in the United States, which I think was greatly appreciated across the board. It was sort of a common meme. I don't know of anybody that returned their checks. But I mean, I'm sure that some wealthy people did to make a gesture. I'm sure that happened so that people could call me a douche when I said something like that.
Yeah.
Some rich asshole in Oklahoma is like, I gave my $1,200 back, and he like owns oil rigs. But you know what I mean? Like this was essentially a democratic socialist approach to caring for the citizenry during the pandemic, right? Like this was an idea that Sanders and a lot of these other politicians endorsed wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that just any welfare or aid from the government necessarily is democratic socialism. I think the real question is who's calling the shots. Is it working class people democratically, or is it the elite few at the top who own, the overwhelming majority of the wealth? I think a report came out recently by Oxfam International showing that the top 1% economically of people in the world own actually twice as much wealth as the bottom 90% of people in the world. That's an extraordinary statistic. And I think that, I think that for most people, the paltry aid that's coming has not been enough. It has not been enough to take care of people. And also, I think when we're seeing, people being expected to return to work, and if they refuse to return to work, regardless of whether there's sufficient PPE, sufficient testing, whether it's safe or not, then they're going to be denied that unemployment. So the picture I'm seeing is not, I wouldn't say it's democratic socialism. I'd say that we have over 130,000 dead and new case records every day. And that has everything to do with the way that healthcare infrastructure has been slashed for the sake of profit. I think you raised an interesting point about the Nordic countries. I would say that that would definitely be an improvement to have a little more social support, more social spending, more welfare. Those would be some positive reforms that could make people's lives better. But I wouldn't say it's socialism. I'd say socialism is something that that we haven't won yet. That there have been great efforts by working class movements to fight for it, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, now I want to run. Muggs, you got something?
Hey Joel, this is Brother Muggs. How's it going?
Pretty good. It's good to meet you, Professor Muggs.
Yeah, doing well, man. Throughout this movement and many other movements in history, symbolism has been a thing that has kind of shaped what's driven a lot of, the opposition's mind. They see symbolism. That is what represents some group. We came across the Providence chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, and we wanted to know if there was, what the significance of and for our listeners, it's a black anchor with two roses on the side.
Yeah, the logo.
The logo itself.
Maybe that that could be a national DSA thing, or is it? I thought it was maybe a Rhode Island one because of the anchor. But yeah, we were curious about your logo.
Yeah, the anchor represents Rhode Island. The rose is a national DSA symbol. I think there's a famous phrase in the history of the socialist movement, bread and roses. It's actually a great working class feminist anthem. Not sure what country it's from. Obviously, it's from some English-speaking country, but the song is called Bread and Roses. Give us bread, but give us roses too. The work, we're not just about, it's not about some kind of very sterile Spartan idea of just barely meeting people's human needs to survive, but actually the socialism is about, it's about more than that. It's about what the rose represents, about, human flourishing.
That's so interesting. I'm so glad you said that, because I do think that that is the image, right? And I may bring in Pat in a second here, as he's a bit older than the rest of us here and at the round table, but I do think the image of a lot of older Americans about socialism is like the USSR, and a lot of propaganda and a lot of truth of like sort of harsh and bleak living conditions and sort of like very gray, functional, like food as sustenance and life as just like a necessity of reality because your eyes open in the morning, and just like this very like brutal, like keep going sort of idea. And I like that the symbolism of the roses, that it doesn't, socialism isn't just like this bleak, like everybody barely gets enough once the wealthy give something up. Like you can have like a sort of a rich life across your citizenry if people are willing to live with some moderation. Pat, I want to hear your hot take on sort of all of these young guns and their impressions of socialism versus someone who grew up in, the 50s and 60s and 70s and sort of all the way through the end of the Cold War. I do think that, I don't know how old Joel is. I'm 27. Muggs, dirty 30,
I'm
right?
30, yeah.
The dirty 30. So we're a bit younger, and maybe we have more positive or at least more open-minded dispositions towards socialism. I think maybe isn't the boogeyman to us that it may be for members of your generation. And Joel, this is like the Jerry Springer moment. Pat Ford is the head of the Libertarian Party in Rhode Island, and you're a Democratic Socialist. So now we'll see.
Well, it's interesting because the reason why this network is called the Coalition reaches back to a moment 8 years ago when a group of people decided to start a network that would recognize vast political differences and seek where overlap exists. Much of the establishment political world divides and conquers and seeks to create bogeyman, to your point, amongst a variety of different political groups, when in fact, for folks who are sincere, there's often overlap. We agree probably as much as we disagree, but again, the political environment that we live in now is all about division and fear. And that's why might be surprising to folks who are listening when you talk about someone who's a capitalist speaking with a young man who's a socialist. I probably loathe Donald Trump more than you do, for reasons too legion to represent. So here's my sense, my hot take. I believe that capitalism, free market capitalism, is the mechanism by which the individual can reach their full human potential. Now, before everyone passes out and starts screaming, the problem is that free market capitalism does not exist in this country, not by any means, which is why the libertarian movement, I went to 3 different press conferences with our governor this week, and in each one of them I took the opportunity with an open forum and an open mic, and they were standing right in front of us, and there's no place to run and no place to hide, to attack corporate cronyism for exactly what it is, which is the theft of individual assets. And it's the theft and the use of governmental coercion to essentially reallocate assets to the connected, the notion of picking winners and losers. So I loathe corporate cronyism.
Well, I was gonna we're gonna bring Nikki on in a second as well, but I had an interesting sort of like horseshoe effect question for the two of you. More so on the idea of like libertarians always being huge proponents of like the primacy of state government over federal government, or certain conservatives of movements being in favor of preserving sort of state government autonomy.
I'm going to jump into that because most of us, I'm actually probably closest to an anarchist than you're probably going to meet in most days. We don't believe in the primacy of any government. I seek to end the state completely, and I mean without regard. So I believe state government is a fundamental infringement of my personal rights that I was born with.
I tend to fall more, I think, on Joel's side of the Venn diagram there in terms of like actually expanding the power of the federal government to help people. Although I understand like that, like there's that constant question of like whether to reform or revolt against a corrupt institution, right? Like there's this dichotomy between reformers and revolutionaries.
From the inside, or do you not?
Do you make change from the inside, right? And I would say like the evidence would say that the system tends to chew up and spit people out who have come, anywhere within like the moderate bandwidth of liberal politics in America who have come in as a reformer.
So,
but I do.
I mean,
Joel,
I'll jump in there about the idea of. So, I think when we talk about everything that we're about comes down to democracy and our push for socialism, our push for working class politics. We think of it as being about democracy and freedom. I think I wouldn't say I'm for expanding the government. I think the question I would have is whose government is it and whose state is it? I think this is a good time to bring in the massive, enormous protests against racist police violence. I think if cops can gun you down in the street just because you're black or Hispanic or indigenous, or sometimes even if you're white, like Daniel Shaver, how free are you?
Familiar with that one, but
I agree completely.
I mean, folks can Google Daniel Shaver, and so I think when it comes, I don't want to expand. I don't want to expand that arm of the state. I don't want them to. I want the cops' budget to be slashed massively. And I think
I agree.
Right. But I do want, I think universal pre-K is a good idea, right? Like, I think a huge amount of money should go into like a very robust public education system. I think that universities should be paid for by the taxpayer. Like, I would be willing to pay, right? This is where, I'm, of course, radically different than Pat, for instance. Like, I would be willing to pay a very high percentage of my taxes in exchange for a guaranteed high and equitable quality of life. And there are countries that are doing much better at approaching that reality than the United States are. And they are using at least techniques or overlapping sort of political philosophies with democratic socialists in terms of how much funding to allocate and where to allocate it. But I'm glad that Joel brought up the protests, because I do want to bring on our next guest, Nikki Kozlowski. All of us are Rhode Islanders here, and we've, this is my first time meeting Joel, but I've seen the DSA out at some of the protest actions over the past few weeks for sure. Definitely been an active presence, and I know that there's a DSA event on Sunday, which will give Joel an opportunity to stump on at the end of this episode. But Nikki is joining us from Oakland, and she was at a massive protest action, I believe spearheaded by the Longshoremen's Union, in which the Port of Oakland was shut down. And the sort of very famous revolutionary speaker, Angela Davis, also spoke at that rally, and Nikki was there for that. So, I think it's a great opportunity to sort of check in with someone from the opposite coast who's tapping into this same sort of power of the people movement that's happening right now. And Nikki.
Well, let me check on the tech on that. I think we might be a couple minutes early. No, we're right on time. I'll have her brought up. But while we're doing that, if I could just again respond to Mr. Reinstein, Again, it might surprise you that, well, first of all, just full disclosure, I'm the outreach director for the Radical Libertarian Caucus of America. We, as part of our platform, would like to end the police, end the war on drugs, end the police. Again, it's a massive forced reallocation of assets to hire people to enforce immoral laws. I don't go by the good apple, bad apple bullshit. All right. To me, anyone who works to enforce immoral laws is in fact immoral. Sounds simple, right? But yet at the same time, the thin blue line is allowed to justify an astonishing degree of horrific behavior and a daily violation of human rights by people who simply don't have the assets, the attorneys to fight them.
And we could get into conversations about complicity amongst communities as well, which is not the same as being a member of the armed forces. But I read a very compelling article by Rebecca Solnit today about that whack job couple of lawyers outside their Italian palace in the middle of Missouri with their weaponry. You know what I mean? Like it's just so absurd. But we have Nikki Kozlowski here, so I do want to say welcome to Nikki, joining us all the way from the West Coast. Thank you. Nikki, you're here with myself, Zane Wolfang, Professor Muggs, who I believe you already know, Pat Ford of the Coalition Radio Network, and Joel Reinstein of the Providence chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Welcome. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh my gosh, what a lineup. So honored to be here. I really enjoy all of these conversations. I've been kind of like listening in to previous episodes. Also, can you hear me right now?
Perfect.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Is it? Oh, yay. That's exciting. So a little bit about myself. I've lived in Oakland for the past almost 10 years. I grew up in Massachusetts. I'm the co-founder of a company called Wisdom Supply Co., and we're a B Corp. And I'm also a community organizer for a group called Zero Waste Youth USA. And I work on waste and waste reduction and climate change and community action.
Would you say that your activism in the field of climate change was sort of your gateway into joining up with other activists and being a part of the Black Lives Matter movement? Have you also been involved in racial justice protesting for some time, or is there some overlap in your eyes over your advocacy work? I know that we were just speaking about how you attended these massive protests in Oakland, and we definitely want to hear about that. And we want to hear about Angela Davis for sure. But I'm interested in sort of the intersectionality of your environmental work and your other social justice work as you see it in the current movement.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yes, to answer your question, my work in climate activism and plastic pollution led me into environmental justice and social justice. I had an idea before about the Black Lives Matter movement and I cared about it, but I would say the environmental movement and learning everything I know about plastic pollution kind of blew the lid off of my consciousness about what's going on in the world and how environmental racism and environmental injustices are inherently tied into that. And how, it's interesting listening to Joel and Pat, and you obviously, and Muggs, talk about these power structures. It's all together. It's all tied together. The same people, the same ruling class who are oppressing people are also it's our extractive economy that is propagating climate change and disposability of humans. And
can I pause you, because I want to ask you to just briefly further define two, I think, really important terms that you just said. The first one is environmental racism, which I think is a more modern academic term that may not be familiar with all of our listeners. And the second one, what did you just say right now? Oh, the extractive economy. And I think Joel may have some weigh in on that as well. But I think I think it would be valuable to dive into both of those terms just a little bit more. I love the vocabulary you're using, and I want to make sure that we all are on the same page with knowing what they mean. So environmental racism, I think, is a very important one to discuss. It's very big picture, right? It's a very big picture thing.
Totally. Absolutely. I'll just give you an example of environmental racism, or a few examples. So in Richmond, here in California, maybe like a 20-minute drive from where I live, is the Chevron refineries. And it's one of the largest Chevron operations in the United States. And, after when slave refugees came to California and they tried to get bank loans to get homes, they weren't allowed to live anywhere else except for these certain areas. So they were redlined. So they were not offered mortgages in wealthy communities. They were told you can only live in Richmond, basically. And this is where Chevron exists.
Less desirable tracts of land, essentially, right?
And also cancer alleys.
Exactly, cancer alleys. And so, reading about these stories about how kids who grew up 1 mile away from these Chevron refineries, they were doing earthquake drills and they were doing chemical explosion drills in their schools. And oftentimes it would explode. And so people are growing up with horrible cancers. If you live near a refinery or a plastics processing plant, you are 56% more likely to get leukemia than if you didn't. And this isn't being covered by the news. Nobody seems to care. There are no regulations. And so that's like an example of environmental racism. Of these externalized costs are forced upon Black and Brown and Indigenous communities.
And I think we can tie right in as well with that same example, maybe to extractive economy, right? In terms of I think a refinery may be a good example of that in a very literal sense, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Sorry.
I was going to say, let me jump in with an example of Rhode Island-based environmental racism. We've got, and you may be familiar, Nikki, with a company called Invenergy, which is an international, particularly heavy on the Northeast, fracked gas oil company. Here in Rhode Island, environmental racism is all over the place because ultimately refineries target poor communities. They make all sorts of promises with regards to property taxes, and then perversely strike all sorts of deals to avoid any real support of the community, while at the same time inflicting really generational costs, as you pointed out so aptly, on people in the community. So it's interesting. It happens everywhere, and there was an attempt by Invenergy to build a plant right in the most pristine part of northwestern Rhode Island, and fortunately, after 4 years of intensive, and I mean intensive fighting, they had to take turn and run, tail beneath their legs, despite the fact that our governor in the state, who claims to be a, if you will, an environmentalist, took significant campaign contributions from the CEO of said company, Invenergy. So it's everywhere. It's a pervasive part of our culture, and again, that's exactly what. And I'm obsessing tonight about a little bit about the overlap, but as a libertarian, I oppose that on about 7 different levels.
I totally get that. I do question whether or not abolishing the government would limit a malicious company like that's ability to just be more extractive in their capitalism if it was just a too free for all. But I do want to hear about sort of a little bit more about the protest in Oakland. I understand that the turnout was quite massive. I understand that I know Joel is a labor organizer, and I understand that organized labor was at the forefront of this protest in Oakland. And I'm also interested to hear about what Angela Davis had to say, and if there's any intersection in what you took away from her speech with some of the issues that you've just been discussing with us now.
Absolutely. I took like crazy person notes so that I could like tell you what she said.
Oh, perfect.
So for one, the experience at the protest was just so, it was so wonderful because you had many different generations of activists show up and work with each other. And even these older activists, these older folks who are leaders of the ILWU were saying how unprecedented this time in history is now. And you had Angela Davis there, but you also had Clarence Thomas, who is a member of the ILWU and a previous Black Panther. You had
The real Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, I know you threw me.
Sorry to interrupt.
Like,
I love the way he does his thing.
Yeah.
No.
Like, what a strange lineup of speakers.
You know,
I know. And you had many parents who had lost their children to police brutality and violence. You had Michael Brown Sr., Oscar Grant's family was there. A number of other parents spoke out. And so it was just so emotional and so wonderful and peaceful. And then you had the whole community of Oakland out celebrating. But what I think is an important part of Angela's speech that I wanted to bring up is she said, if I had not chosen to become a professor, my next choice would have been to become a dock worker so I could be a member of the most radical union in the country.
Yeah,
and I
read that.
Yeah, it's super important because, and I also want to quote Boots Riley. He was there as well. And he said that the working class, basically paraphrasing, working class creates the wealth, and wealth is power, and we have the power to withhold that. And we're not going to say, we won't do X, Y, and Z until. No, sorry, I'm messing that quote up. He's basically saying that we're going to withhold that power, and we're not going to give it back until you meet these demands. Not asking demands, not saying, please do this, please abolish the police. You're going to abolish the police because we hold the wealth and the power. And that was ultimately my takeaway from the protest, is that collectively we have so much power when we can organize together.
Can I ask Joel a question?
Please.
Sorry, I didn't realize you were still building steam. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I wanted to ask Joel a question because like the quote from Miss Angela Davis is so powerful about joining this radical labor union, right? And this idea. But I want to ask Joel, because he's working in labor organizing here on the East Coast. Is there a robust radical organized labor movement in Rhode Island or in the Northeast or on the East Coast? I feel in Rhode Island that unions play critical roles in elections, not always in the most positive way necessarily. But I don't know I don't know how strong the organized labor. I don't know if we have something comparable to this very radical and very powerful longshoremen's union out in the Port of Oakland.
Sure. I mean, I think it's up to us to make it stronger. But we do have some great unions here in Rhode Island. I think we saw recently the strike at across New England at the Stop and Shop grocery chain. Victoria's strike was a great demonstration of workers' power. I got a chance to go out to one of their picket lines and see them in action, actively maintaining a picket line, discouraging people from crossing. I think both Angela Davis and Boots Riley's points about working class power are what I would really, really emphasize. I think the overwhelming majority of people who do the work that makes society run together have potentially an enormous amount of power, because the tiny minority of capitalists depend on our labor. There's any number of cliches you want to reach for. No wheel turns without us. Actually, and I would say our most powerful tool is like what Boots described. I'm so appreciative to Nikki for sharing that anecdote. Withholding our labor en masse together, standing strong together, and refusing to work until our demands are met is incredibly powerful. We also have, as a class, we have power outside the workplace as well. I think the example of the protests in Minneapolis, I think, the authorities are wonderfully neutral, objective, totally impartial justice system decided that they weren't going to prosecute the 4 cops who murdered George Floyd. And so black and brown and people of all races, working class youth in Minneapolis in massive numbers took to the streets, mounted an uprising and raised hell and caused unrest. And then suddenly, a few days later, our completely impartial justice system changed their minds and decided they were going to prosecute. So I think what's remarkable about that, what I would point to, is not only that example of working class power, but actually a way that our class, took some decision-making power away from the people who normally run every facet of our lives. And that's I think that's the lesson to take out of it, and so many other struggles. I think a lot of positive things that we've won that look like it's, or that, that are, I agree with what you said earlier, Zane, about, I think, more spending for healthcare, more spending for education, Medicare for all, free college, absolutely vital. And I think in the past, when we've won things like, what little Medicare we do have, when we've won, Social Security, improvements to infrastructure, I think behind every victory is a massive display of working class power exerting pressure and forcing concessions.
Joel, I'd like to jump in real quick and talk about what you're saying, all the good things that have come out of the movement, how withholding that wealth from the upper class has paid off in its own way. I'd like to ask you, and then kind of transition over to the movement over in Oakland, is how do we maintain that momentum? I feel like at the beginning, not at the beginning, once George Floyd was murdered, the momentum and pure anger of the people was so. I mean, I don't know if you were at the State House that day, that there were 10,000 people down there.
On the 5th, right?
On the 5th. I haven't seen that many people downtown since the Gravity Games. So it's like kind of crazy that, the next protest afterwards is maybe, 10% of that. And then it got smaller and smaller. So I just want to know what is it do you think that can be done or to maintain this, momentum?
For Joel and Nikki, right? Coast to coast here, seeing very different protest scenes. Right. Yeah.
For sure.
Speaking on the momentum of the movement at the current moment. Maybe Joel, give us a hot take, and then Nikki can follow up with the West Coast.
Yeah, I'd say a couple things, and one is that I think the current wave of uprising is built off of past waves of uprising. In 2012, when Trayvon Martin was murdered and George Zimmerman was acquitted, there were huge protests across the country. And then, of course, 2014. Inaugurated the Black Lives Matter movement with uprisings in Ferguson and later in Baltimore, and then the outrage dies away and the crowds diminish, and you would hear at these protests. I remember in 2012 at a protest in Detroit, someone saying this has to be a movement and not a moment. I think the way we do that is that we need to be organized. We need to have groups of us coming together that are making decisions together in a structured way, that are accountable to each other, that are taking action on a regular basis, to go out and talk to other working class people. There's no substitute for the one-on-one conversation that folks familiar with the union movement might be familiar with. But you go out and talk to people one-on-one, every time, if there's 10,000 people on the state lawn demanding action, and almost all of them are at the first protest of their lives, the role of every socialist, and I think anyone who wants to fight for social justice, is to be in an organization and go out and talk to those people and ask them, first of all, why are you out here? What do you think about this? What do you think needs to be done? Empowering people by showing them that their opinion actually counts is a great starting place. And then talking to them about, like, what can we do together? Hey, this organization I'm part of, we're taking action by phone banking local politicians to demand that they stop taking money from cop unions, or to demand that they cut the cops' budget. Will you join us at this exact day and time that I have ready, that I'm out talking to you about, to join us for that phone banking, and then start building those relationships one-on-one and grow the organization from there. I think in between the spontaneous outbursts, they're always going to happen. There's always crises under capitalism. In between those, we've got to be organized. We've got to be doing everything we can to grow our strength in numbers.
Nikki, could you speak on, as Muggs indicated, right? We had this massive protest, and there's been sustained action with dwindling numbers. Is that the same that you see in Oakland? Is there still quite a sustained energy there that we're not seeing here? What does the momentum feel like where you are in Oakland?
Well, I would say that the energy isn't quite as sustained as the Juneteenth protests. But overall, I think Oakland has a lot of solidarity and community, just like I live by Lake Merritt, for example, and when I walk to the lake, there's just people everywhere, and we always say hi to each other. And that like wonderful sense of like, these are my people, it really taps into your sense of love for those people. And so you have that desire to want to keep working on things and fighting. And someone who really influenced my activism career told me that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so, yes, we might see these big outbursts and then it kind of trickle down. But, to Joel's point, we do have to get organized. And I think that now is such a different time in history than ever before, because we're so connected. And because of that, like through, social media, through our phones, through sitting at home because of COVID, because of this connection, we're now connecting the dots between different movements. Like, maybe 6 or 7 years ago when I first got into plastic pollution, it was working in its own silo. It wasn't connected to the climate movement or social justice. And now we're seeing all of the movements come together in one, and many different organizations across many different platforms are all working in solidarity with one another. So I understand frustration with it not being like the energy not being upheld, but I think that the arc of history is bending towards justice, and we're all coming together and getting more organized. And there's only up from here.
Do you mind if I jump in with a perspective from the old guy?
Absolutely, Pat.
Yeah.
I was waiting.
All right. So unless you introduce civil disobedience at a higher level, until you interfere with the means of production, until you become a pain in the ass, until you disrupt, folks will continue to co-opt the message as they did in the later stages, if you will, of that 4 to 5 week period surrounding the Black Lives Matter protests. Now you've got the spectacle of major corporations who are actually looking to project a caring, if you will, environment, because they'll play soulful music, they'll buy a 30-second spot, and at the end there'll be a pitch for their product. Every one of the companies that does that needs to be examined harshly through the spectacle of, if you will, of consumer support, and made to understand that not only do they need to adopt a soulful image, that they care and that we're all in this together. Right. And then unless you do that,
even change on Black Lives Matter for sure.
Right.
For sure. People are making money hand over fist.
Yep. So, folks, as a guy who believes in civil disobedience, we need to throw a mix in that. We need to respect individual rights. We need to respect property rights in the community. But at the same time, unless you are a disruptor, you will be on the sidelines.
I think that's important. I think that's an important message. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Nikki. No, we're going to close out soon, but hold on, Nikki. Let me close out with your last point, and then also tell us anything you want to tell us about the environmental initiative that you're involved in. Sort of cap yourself off with any outreach. Use our immensely influential platform to let the people know, and then afterwards we'll give Joel the same sterling opportunity.
Awesome. I just wanted to say how much I agree with Pat, and how I think that things, the sort of optimistic outlook that I gave earlier is because I know things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. in terms of climate, in terms of what's going on with COVID, in terms of people's quality of life, it's going to get a lot worse. And people are going to get angrier and angrier. And so I think we do have to figure out how to channel that anger into something productive. And we can spend this time now figuring out how to organize, how to reach people, what our demands are, and how to push forward civil disobedience in a way that really hurts. Like, for example, the ILWU shutting down all of the ports on the West Coast. It wasn't just Oakland. It was from
Long Beach,
Washington down. Yeah, exactly. And we could do a sustained shutdown for many days across many different unions, for example. But I really believe things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. And so we can take that time to figure out what we're going to do with our anger about that. And it's funny, last thing I swear, I'm going to say it. Actually, Angela Davis used to be in my yoga class. And I went up to her and I was like, but like not in a weird way. And I asked her, I was like, here's something. I told her, I was like, Angela, I'm so angry about so many things. Like, what can I do? And she was like, are you involved in an organization? And I told her about the organizations I was involved in environmentalism. And she gave me some examples of where I could go in terms of social justice organizations, which was, I'd like to mention, Critical Resistance. And she just told me to channel my anger. It's good to be angry. Channel it. Do something with it. Don't just sit there and be mad. So, to put a plug for environmental things, I would really just like people to look up Break Free from Plastic. I have a billion different places you could go to and resources you can read, and you can reach out to me personally on my Instagram. I don't know where to put that. Nikki Faye, whatever. I'll write it down and you can see it. But look up Break Free from Plastic and look at how Break Free from Plastic is a global organization of over 8,000 nonprofits working to unify a message. And I think that can be a wonderful example.
BREAK.
Yeah, Break Free from Plastic.
Okay, breakfreefromplastic.org. Okay. Yeah. All right, Joel, follow up Angela Davis's advice at yoga class with the latest about the Providence Democratic Socialists of America.
Yeah, you can never go wrong following advice from Angela Davis. She's totally right. Anger is a great motivator. It's a great way to overcome fear of retaliation. And we've seen from the way police have treated protesters across the country with totally vicious, depraved levels of violence that it's definitely scary, and it's definitely something to be real about. And yeah, anger is a great motivator. Here in Providence, so I think we've seen just recently several city councilors have pledged that they won't vote for a budget that doesn't defund the police. And I think that's another great step forward. I believe it's Sabina Matos, Helen Anthony, Nervo LaFortune, can't remember the fourth, but folks can Google it. And we've also had, I think what we at Providence DSA have been doing is a couple of things. One is some of our members have done some pretty incredible research about which local politicians are taking money from the police. Let me check. I don't have the URL in front of me. I'll Google that really quick. But in the meantime, I would just point out that we've got 4 given that they've received from police unions and correctional officers unions. Sabina Matos is one of them. Aaron Regenberg, Gail Golden, and Bridget Valverde.
Sorry, your connection broke up for a second, Joel, but I believe you were saying those politicians were pressured into returning the donations or donating an equivalent amount of money, right? Like Sabina Matos received like $1,300 from the police union, but she donated $1,300 to Black Lives Matter or some equivalent social justice organization to negate right? Is that what
Exactly.
is that what was happening?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think folks can see the spreadsheet that some of our members put together with their research. It's nocopmoneyri.org. So again, nocopmoneyri.org. This is something that we're constantly updating every time we hear from somebody. And I think we're going to be looking to get more cop money out of politics, but also, wanted to mention the event on Sunday at 3 at the State House. We're having a defund the police protest, and also a little bit of a kind of a festival of the oppressed, kind of a party to celebrate our resistance. So it's still a protest, but we're also calling it a party at the State House. We're doing this together with several other local activist groups. And this would be a great chance to, connect with local organizing and get involved in actually, taking action together as the spontaneous moment dies down to keep, to start building organization that's sustainable. And I think one stat I wanted to share from the research that our members did, the Providence Police Department actually has an operating budget of over $86 million, which is almost all of the $93 million the city gets from the state. And Providence actually spends, if you add that up, Providence spends $476 per person on policing, which is more than Minneapolis, $408, and it's even more than Los Angeles, with one of the most notoriously violent and racist police departments in the country.
Joel, thank you very much. Nikki, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on the show. We would love to have each of you back again. I'm glad you were willing to come on together. I think the conversation was great. Let's run through it. Nikki Kozlowski, environmental activist from Oakland, California. Well, from Massachusetts, but living in Oakland, California. BreakFreeFromPlastic.org. And then Joel Reinstein, labor organizer and member of the Providence Democratic Socialists of America, nocopmoneyri.org, providencedsa.org, State House Defund the Police Party on Sunday, July 10th at 3:00 p.m. Wear a mask, BYOB. Just kidding. I don't know what the B situation is out there.
That's July 12th, by the way.
July 12th. July 12th at 3 p.m. at the State House. I will certainly be there. Hope to definitely see some increased participation after a bit of a lull. We don't bite. There's a lot of interesting organizations out there, as Joel and Nikki have been speaking to, as Pat has been speaking to, for people who want to get involved and instigate and see more return on their sort of reality of living in this society. So Joel, Nikki, Pat, Professor Muggs, thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night. And Joel, we'll see you. We'll see you at the action.
Thanks. Bye, Nikki.
Awesome.
Bye, Joel.
Solidarity.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.